Hello and welcome to the Rad Dad Podcast. Today my guest on the show is Giri Sreenivas, founder of the Privacy Labs here in Bellevue, Washington. Giri and I will talk about what it's like to be raising a family while being an entrepreneur, what it's like to be raising a multicultural family here in Bellevue, Washington, and how it might be different from other parts of the country. And of course we're going to talk about what privacy is and how it's changed over the last couple of decades, where it's going and how it's going to affect our kids. Without further ado, Giri, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm happy to share my experiences, and yeah, if it's helpful to someone else, that's great.
So let's see, how old are your kids right now?
So I have a 5.5-year-old and 2 years and 9 months. So
5.5 and almost 3?
Yeah. Yep, that's right.
And have you been a startup guy this whole time that you've had kids?
I have. Well, pretty much, yeah. So we were expecting our first child when I was running my first company with my co-founder. And shortly after he was born, our company was acquired. And so I became less of a startup guy in that I was not sort of the founder, really running the whole show or, with my co-founder, but I was part of a much larger organization, right? So the company that acquired us was about 280 people, and I would describe them as being a late-stage startup to the point of, we took the company public in 2015. And so I was, there through a lot of that growth, and then spent some time there, post-IPO as well, and then got back to starting a new company. So I've kind of, seen various sort of life cycles of the startup as a parent. Yeah.
Actually, do you think it was part of the reason to sell the company that you had a kid coming?
It's a fair question. It's a good question. For us, I mean, it wasn't part of the decision-making process, right? I mean, I think it's always a peripheral factor because anytime you make a significant decision to sell your company, and your company in many ways is like a baby. It's like your baby, right? So it was a peripheral factor, but it was not a key thing that drove one way or the other. I mean, ultimately the decision was driven by, my co-founder and myself and the market and the suitors, right? I mean, it was a combination of all of those things that made it seem like this was a good move for everybody who was involved. But yeah, it was nice to have the pressure ease off a bit with a very young child at home. My son was born in July, and we closed the acquisition in the first half of October. So it was pretty close.
Actually, for our startup listeners, I'll be curious to know, and I was just talking to another founder this morning about acquisition when you have a young kid. How was that? I mean, I'm sure it was pretty impactful, right? You're trying to do this business deal, super high stress, and...
Yeah, I mean, so the company that acquired us is based on the East Coast, and we're here in the Great Pacific Northwest, and so that time difference is an interesting thing. There were several occasions where I was up in the middle of the night, feeding my son, and in one hand, holding the bottle, feeding him or getting him to sleep, and in the other hand, reading and replying to emails about making the deal move forward. And on the other side of the table, the corp dev team was like, what are you doing up at this hour, right? It's like it's 2 a.m. your time or 3 a.m. your time. It's like, well, I'm up because, I'm taking care of my kid, and if I'm going to be up and holding him while he's sleeping, and, there's some things that I can help move forward, because the shorter that process takes, the easier it is for everybody, right? Yeah. So, so that happened on more than one occasion, and it was. It's very tiring to have a very young baby at home because of what it does to your sleep schedule, and then you tack on the stress of actually trying to close a deal. It's a tough time period, but we had thankfully we had some help along the way. We had good people involved on both sides and good advisors, and we were able to make it through.
I mean, judging by you, the way you say it wasn't that impactful, right? Probably you were doing startups by then, so you're already used to not sleeping for more than 4 hours a night, like that stuff.
Yeah, that's a fundamental difference, I think, between the first company and the second company, right? So I went into the first startup kind of not paying too much attention to my sleep and my health. So yeah, there were a lot of nights where 3, 4, 5 hours was kind of the norm. This time around, I really, I try to make sure I get at least 6 hours a night, and usually at least 7 hours a night. And it makes a huge difference. But yeah, the first time around with that little sleep, you introduce a baby into it. What I would say is the difference is, you when you're just running a startup and you need to get that sleep, you just get that core amount of rest. You still get to dictate when you start going to bed and when you wake up, right? You get to set that time.
Yep.
And as because you've got kids too, you don't have those choices with babies, with young children, right? At that age, it's everything. You do everything and anything in your power to make them thrive. And a lot of that is you have to be super responsive to their needs. And so that can throw a wrench in things. And so I remember dealing with that in terms of thinking about, okay, our son usually wakes up between these hours. So maybe I'm going to go to sleep this many hours before then, or I'm going to stay up until that first night feeding happens and then try to sleep before the next feeding. There's a lot of micro planning that goes into that whole process that I kind of remember sweating a lot of those details, trying to eke in the rest when I could. And certainly after our son was born, we got a couch at the office, and I would occasionally crash on the couch and just take 15-minute, half an hour naps here and there. And I think it was, my team understood. Some of them had families, some of them didn't. But I think I wanted to sort of lead a little bit by example, and that hey, if you need the rest, you got to take the rest, right? It doesn't do anyone well for you to just be forcing yourself to grind it out otherwise. So.
Actually, so speaking of leading, was your wife working at the time? Because, Because I'm curious, how do you show up to work and lead a team while you completely sleep deprived and you still need to get home to take care of the baby? And there are these competing priorities because startups, or in general, I think looking outside of startups, for anyone working in a high-stress environment, where you want to accomplish things, right? You work. For a lot of people, work gives them meaning, and it takes away from time with kids. So how do you manage this, and how do you set the goals for your team such that they know that you're still a good dad, you're not just driving everyone insane, right?
Yeah. So you asked the question about whether my wife was. So my wife works. She's an attorney. Thankfully, she is in an area of law where there is a reasonable demand in terms of work and ability and time for space for family. But yeah, after our son was born, she took some time off, typical sort of maternity leave. She was able to take some time off from work. And, in terms of that, how do you balance that, and how do you lead and set that example? I think that, Dirk and I, we both have, my co-founder Dirk and I, we both have this mentality of lead by example, within our organization. Some of it is explicit and vocal and verbal, and you write things down and you walk through a plan and you talk about it. But a lot of it is you lead by example with the work ethic and accomplishments and things like that. And I think a lot of that also comes with how you show what it is that you value, right? So, I was pretty transparent with my team, right? And particularly with my co-founder. It's my first time going through it. Mm-hmm. And as much as I talked to friends and family and tried to understand what it was going to be like to be a dad, nothing prepares you, right? Just that moment when our son was born, from that time forward, I was just wow, none of those conversations really prepared me for what is ahead.
You're not helping. This podcast is helping people prepare for that.
Yeah, well, I think that there's nothing.
I'm just kidding.
No, it's a fair point. There's nothing that prepares you for I think the emotions around it, right? Mm-hmm. I think that there are structural things that can be done with planning in terms of your what you do with your life and how you prioritize your time and those sorts of things. And so my biggest thing with the team was to try to be transparent and say, look, this happened with my family, and so I'm going to be in late, or I need to leave early, or I need to crash on the couch for half an hour before I do this, that, or the other. And I think that my hope is that it helped convey to the team what it meant and how engaged I was at home with what was going on, and. Sort of the more recent example now is, I drop my son off at school every day in the morning. I pick him up every day, or most days, and my co-founder, he coaches some sports teams for his sons, and that's we talk about that with the team. Like, we explain, like, hey, these are things that are important to us, and we do them, and these are commitments that allow us to kind of spend the time that allows us to have that bond with our family. Because for both my co-founder and I, family is really important, right? We love what we're doing, and it to your point earlier about work giving people purpose. I would say we found a purpose professionally, and it turns out that the most efficient way to achieve that purpose is through a startup right now. But family is super high priority for us, and so we just make that evident in how we conduct ourselves around everyone that we work with. We don't try to keep that stuff in the shadows.
Actually, as a boss, I'm also curious how you navigate this, because you explained that this is important to you, but I assume as your team grows, right? They're going to be single people. They're going to be people with families. They're going to be people with sort of like cultural priorities, this and that. It's all going to be very different, right? How do you set these goals in such a way where kind of everyone understands that there's work time and that there's personal time? And also, I'm just thinking, looking at other startups and kind of high growth companies that I see, especially out of Silicon Valley, right? It's really easy to get caught up and say like office time. I remember talking to one founder who said, well, you just can't leave work till maybe 6:30 or 7 because what would people think about you? Like, even if you get to office at 4 o'clock in the morning, because you can, if you leave before other people leave, well, you're a horrible person.
That's a toxic culture, right? I mean, we tend to focus on the contributions that people make and not the time that they spend sitting in a chair where we can see them. It is important for us as a team and for our culture to have common overlapping hours where we're all in the office. But that's guidance, right? That's not like a hard concrete rule. So when we talk about it with prospective hires and we explain to them what it is we're building, and naturally lots of people have questions about what it's like to come join an early stage company. Not a lot of people that we talk to have experience working at this stage of a company. And a lot of people ask me, well, how much do you work? Right? How many hours do you spend? And I'm like, well, I can answer that question if I sit down and try to add it all up. But for me, what I do doesn't feel like work. Like this is like a life purpose for me, right? So it's not like the directly translatable conversation with, or directly translatable hours for someone who's joining a company versus someone who starts something like this. But I do think that we try to be pretty transparent with people that coming into an early stage company is pretty demanding, right? Early stage startups are trying to do the impossible, right? That's just by their very nature, they're trying to achieve the impossible. And so some of that means that you have to figure out, even in your own life, how you occasionally achieve moments of the impossible. And that requires a certain amount of work. I think that it's not about gauging how many hours people are in the office. I think it's about gauging the level of contribution. And we set goals and priorities based on like what our business realities are, and then we turn the dial on those based on what people are able to achieve within that framework, right? So if we've got a milestone that we're trying to hit, we set that as a goal for the team. We talk with the team and get feedback, right? I don't think that you can lead by saying, hey, we want to get to a certain point in a certain period of time with who we've got, and then that's just the absolute standard. You have to be able to calibrate based on who you have and what's going on with them. And that, it's hard, right? I mean, it's hard on the people who are within the team, because if you've got people who really believe and everybody's rowing in the boat in the same direction, and they themselves are dealing with the internal struggle of how to balance what's professional and what's personal, and you as a leader of a business are struggling and trying to find that balance of how do we make sure that we achieve these goals and, respect what people's needs are. You have to constantly be okay with imperfection, right? And I think that it's, it depends on everyone's personality type, right? Some people, things are very black and white, and for other people, they're totally okay in the gray space. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if you want to be in, startup land, you got to be really comfortable with gray space.
So can we talk about what it is that you're working on, or not quite yet?
We can talk about it high level, right? I mean, we have not disclosed what the product does. We're still working on it. We will have more to say later this year. But, the way to think about this is, the internet has shifted away from its roots, mm-hmm. right? When I came up on the internet in the 90s as a kid, right? Probably not too different from you. Maybe a handful of years ahead of you. Yeah. And at that time, you could do quite a bit of personal discovery. You could explore a whole bunch of interesting topics. There's a whole bunch of things that you could do online, and you never really had to think much about your privacy or your security. Mm-hmm. You just there was an inherent level of accepted privacy and security in the way things were done, in spite of the protocols themselves not actually being secure, mm-hmm. which is kind of interesting, right? The core protocols of the internet were decentralized by their very nature at the beginning, right? And what we've seen is, in an effort to ease the experiences around different services online, we've seen this concentration of power mm-hmm. amongst a handful of companies, right? Yeah. Well, sure. You can talk about, ISPs are an interesting one, but I tend to think about Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook, right? Mm-hmm. These are the sort of the big five, and they have created a new data economy, right? Data is the new oil, mm-hmm. and what I think and what I find most fascinating about it is when you sit down with people and you are able to walk them through that unconscious trade that they've made mm-hmm. when they have given up control of their personal data, people are kind of shocked and surprised, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with it. And so we sort of got turned on to this whole thing after the Snowden revelations in 2013. Mm-hmm. Right? We started talking about what each of us had done on our own over the years to maintain control and ownership of our personal data. And we identified a couple of things that were common. And from there, we decided, we are able to do these things because we have a significant level of knowledge and technical sophistication and interest and time, mm-hmm. right? The combination of those things allowed us to not rely on Google for certain things or not mm-hmm. rely on Dropbox for certain things. And we decided, well, let's build something for ourselves that makes this easy. We don't have to waste all this time, being IT admins on the side, mm-hmm. right? And then once we solve that and we feel good about the user experience around it, or we feel like we can get to a nice place on it, let's go see if there are other people out there who are like us. Are there enough of them to go build something that's interesting mm-hmm. and compelling? And when we did that research, we figured out there are a lot of people out there right now who feel pretty hopeless or helpless around their control and ownership of their personal data and all the privacy and security benefits that come from that. So, that's what Privacy Labs is about, right? It's about the power to be free. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the power to be in control, have privacy and security over your personal data. And there's a lot more coming that we'll talk about later in the year. I'm pretty excited. This is going to be a big year for us, so we'll have a lot of news.
Do you have a timeline sometime in the summer, or, what do we? Depends on how things go.
Second half of this year, we'll have a lot more to say.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. You guys are so stealth. I want to know things.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in, you have to...
The paranoid survive?
Well, you got to be paranoid about that. Paranoid about competition, all of that. But I think also it's, it takes time to build a meaningful moat, mm-hmm. right? One of the reasons, we are working on a combination of hardware, software, and services, mm-hmm. right? And so if you're doing a software-only company these days, the moat, it's very difficult to build a moat. It's one of the reasons why you see a lot of these acqui-hires where they're primarily talent, and the talent is fairly hard to come by, because you need that level of talent to actually be able to develop a moat.
Well, because the big choice is, do I hire 10 people to go and build whatever it is that I'm thinking of buying, or do I just pay a little bit extra and buy it now and plug it into my ecosystem today?
I'm seeing, and I'm even talking about acquisitions before the product is fully baked. And I think it's because it's hard enough to get that talent. Yeah, if you take a look at like a lot of deep learning talent, right? You know, there are teams that are being built and acquired or built and funded at extremely high valuations, primarily because it's just so hard to find and come by those people. And it's becoming meaningfully important because that's a leading indicator of how difficult it is to establish that moat. So for us, right, you know, we're in a different space, but for us to be able to establish that moat around, you know, the product, the technology, and the experience, it takes time, right? And, you know, we're keen on developing, you know, what we have in our minds. We're keen on getting feedback from users, you know, honing what the experience is like, honing how we talk about it before you go out. And you don't get too many shots at like the 15 minutes, right?
Yep.
So when you get them, you got to make the most of them. I was actually really reluctant to announce our financing, right? You know, news about our financing came out almost exactly a year ago. And we had this debate about should we file the SEC Form D or should we not? And ultimately we decided to do that.
Is it because once you announce financing, basically a timer starts and people start judging you on what your progress is? Or
people start asking questions, and, you know, which is fine. But, you know, it takes you out of relative anonymity, right? And I think that's why you see that there are a lot of companies in the Valley and even some companies up here who just don't announce that first financing. I mean, I think I read about 2 companies today that announced their financing, which was a combination of like their seed and Series A at the same time, right? They put it out at the same time. And I think there are more and more people who are recognizing like the value and the importance of being able to work under the radar and develop what you're doing.
Why give your competition just extra advantages, right, by telling them what you're doing?
Yeah.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But, well, actually, speaking of privacy and the future, what do you think what the future is going to look like for our kids? Or, you know, whether or not you're successful or you're just one piece of the puzzle in privacy and and I've had a kind of, I guess, different number of conversations with users, and there's certainly ones who appreciate privacy, but the ones who actually have no idea that their privacy has been completely exploited, and when you tell them, they don't actually even believe that it could be exploited to such an extent, and then almost maybe even reject that notion, right? Because you don't really want to know that everything about you is known to somebody. Like, there are companies out there that know more about you, well, not you in this case, but a single person, more than that person probably knows about themselves, right, in some cases. But anyways, given all of that, like, where do you think we're going in the future? And, like, what's it going to look like for our kids 30 years from now, right? Like, what kind of issues do you think they're going to deal with? I'm just curious what you think about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, starting from today and kind of looking forward, right? I mean, I've got friends on Facebook or Instagram or even Twitter that have created accounts for their children already.
I've done that, but just so that Facebook doesn't create it for my children.
Oh, doesn't take it? Okay, yeah. But then they're kind of like posting through their child's account. And I think it's interesting. I mean, look, I registered domains in my kids' names, right, just so that we'd have them. I think that, you know, it's looking, you know, to look at what it's going to be like in the next 30 years, I kind of look at what it's like, what the difference is generationally between like our parents' generation, you know, our generation, and then kind of like the younger millennials coming up behind us, right? And, you know, our parents' generation has a much stronger core sort of intrinsic belief around privacy and how to view that. I mean, I got a lot of my beliefs and ideals around privacy from my parents, right? You know, when in the 80s and 90s, my parents were shredding their mail. Not because they had anything to hide, but just because they believed, they're like, we don't want other people in our business, right? Yeah. And now these are things that are like sort of more common practice, right? So what I look at is like we have more of an awareness around privacy, and then maybe as you get into younger and younger generations, there may be less awareness and therefore less of a willingness or ability to believe what companies are able to gather about us and what they're able to do with that information. Now, I do think that there are some very interesting things happening right now that are kind of shaking that trend, right? And a key one is what happened with the intervention in the election, right? So it is becoming increasingly clear that public information about people has been used to target them with misinformation for the purposes of more or less manipulating them one way or the other, right? I mean, the fact that Russia was able to orchestrate a white supremacy rally in the U.S. and have people on both sides show up is kind of amazing, right? I mean,
it is actually amazing, right?
In a bad way, right? Yeah.
Well, bad maybe, but it's still pretty fascinating that somebody can do that.
Right. It's exactly. And so what I'm getting at is I think that there's actually there's a tailwind around people understanding what it means to put your information out there, how it can be used, what ends can be accomplished with it, right? And so that's sort of on a macro scale, right? Like if people are not happy with what happened in the election, right, and what's going on with everything after that, they're going to take a look at that and say, well, here are some of the root causes around that, right? This was a framework and a product, really, that was susceptible to this type of tampering and abuse. And it would not have necessarily been possible if this sort of micro-targeting was not available, right? And you take a look at the number of votes that swung the election and how much money was put in. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling, like if you believe that it may have actually influenced the election. So I think that's there is this tailwind around increasing awareness of what it means to put your data out there. I think that there are also hints and indicators that, what I like to tell people is like, generationally, as you go younger, maybe people are willing to share more, but that does not necessarily mean they don't care about privacy. And I look at Snapchat as a great example of that, right? I mean, I think that a lot of the early bias against Snapchat was like, oh, this is just being used to send illicit pictures back and forth. But really, the core value is that people wanted to send an ephemeral message that went away, right? And if you boil that down, the essence of it is like, I don't want people to have a lasting capture of whatever that communication was. That's a privacy-centric core belief. And those early users were kids, right? They were not like our parents' generation.
Yeah, they were like high school kids.
Exactly. So those are the types of things that lead me to believe that there is this underlying tailwind that and we are also benefiting from the fact that just by virtue of younger people sort of aging into being adults in a more technology savvy time, the average population is more tech literate. Right. And I think that creates the opportunity to have, meaningful and intelligent discussions about the trade-offs of deciding to have a Facebook account or deciding to use Gmail or whatever these services are.
So in a way, we're going through an inflection point, and when our kids grow older, things may be substantially better for them if we do it right now.
Yeah. I think we are in an inflection point, and this is an opportunity for us to change the course of things, right? It's if as a society and a culture we decide to go all in on entrusting a handful of companies with this degree of control and this degree of influence over our day-to-day lives, the future does not bode well for our children. Right. I think if we look at an opportunity, we look at the opportunities to return control back to people and have them be in more control and have more of that autonomy, then the future bodes well for our children because they will be able to make decisions about their information and their data as opposed to having that decision made for them.
I agree. So actually thinking about the past, well, you said your privacy focus right now is influenced in a way by your parents in the past, and you grew up around here, right?
I did.
You were the kid.
Yeah, I grew up in.
I'm just curious, how did the area life, everything really changed, right? Like, are there any drastic differences that you can see? Lately we have a lot of these. In general, say in tech, we have a lot of revelations about sexism and just like bad characters, but then you talk to people and they say, well, actually in history everything kind of repeats itself. That may be a deep question, but in essence, just kind of like life in general, what do you think has changed, and what do you think maybe influenced you the most as a parent to be like who you are today? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but like you were growing up here, it was not quite a farm town, but it was definitely not this booming city we are in right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was quite a bit of growth here. Just, when I was growing up around here, Microsoft was driving a lot of that growth. Boeing was driving a lot of that growth. So you had large employers who were driving a lot of that growth and bringing a lot of people to the area, right? So when I was in school, I would say about a quarter of the kids that I went to school with were immigrants or children of immigrants. Right, and I'm a child of, my parents immigrated here, so I'm a child of immigrants. Now, looking at the schools that my children will go to, it's north of 50%, right? North of 50% of the kids are immigrants or children of immigrants. And this, this city is now a majority city, right? So the constitution of companies that are here, that are developing offices, that are attracting talent, it is attracting people from all over the country and all over the world. I mean, even for us, when we're recruiting, we run across quite a few candidates who have immigrated from their home country to another part of the U.S. And then have decided subsequent to that they want to come, to the Seattle area. It's a city that's got a lot of attraction for a lot of people right now, because the cost of living hasn't yet caught up with some of the other major metros.
You think we're still behind on...
We're still behind the Bay, for sure.
San Francisco is in a league of its own.
Yeah. But San Francisco, Silicon Valley, that whole stretch, right?
It's as close to Elysium as you can get, though, right? So there's kind of Silicon Valley and then the rest of the world. Well, okay, no, there's like... Singapore's of the world and so forth.
Yeah,
but I mean,
New York.
In North America, right?
Yeah, sure.
Well, even in New York, you can kind of still like live in New York, maybe in Brooklyn, maybe a little bit outside, and commute to the city. In Silicon Valley, I know people who commute for like hour and a half every day just because there's really no affordable living. But so
I mean, I think that's one of the changes I've seen. Right, is that the number of companies that have come here has grown pretty dramatically. Everyone's got an engineering outpost here. All the big companies have engineering outposts here. And that's drawn quite a bit of talent to the area. It's led to a tremendous amount of growth. I think when I was growing up here, we were maybe 75, 80,000 people in the city. Now I think we're pushing like 130, 140,000 people in the city. So, we're close to doubling, maybe in a 20-year time period, which is an interesting phenomenon. I know Seattle has added, I think 100,000 people, in like the past 10 years or something like that. I mean, it's a phenomenal period of growth for the city, and there are associated pains that come with it. One of them is just affordability and housing costs. But yeah, your other question about history repeating itself and all the things that we're becoming privy to. I mean, I think with sexism and racism in the workplace, what's fundamentally different now about things versus back then is I think that there's more of a light being shined on it, and there's more pressure for that to not be accepted or tolerated behavior. And I'm it's overdue as far as I'm concerned, right? It's way overdue.
But then, like you said, you were here, and the city was about a quarter immigrants or kids of immigrants, right? And now it's over 50%. So it sounds like, personally, that's what attracted me to Seattle as well. I love diversity, right? I went to a university in Toronto, and that was one of the major appealing factors because everyone was from everywhere, right? It was like you'd never have a boring conversation, and the same is about Seattle right now. But so to me, it seems like it's getting a lot better if this is the kind of thing you're into. But do you think it's getting better? Or, I mean, were all the same norms we have right now around 40 years ago? Well, not 40, but, sometime in the past, right? but we just didn't have any visibility into it, or like did this diversity really improve the situation?
Well, I think diversity it always improves the situation. There's almost no situation by which is not improved by having more diversity of thought, more diversity of backgrounds. People from around the world, people from different economic backgrounds, people of different genders. That is all goodness, and we need way more of it. Like, where we're speaking, right, in a suburb of Seattle, we have this diversity. Seattle proper is one of the whitest cities in the country.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. It's Portland and Seattle, I think, are like top 5 or top 10 like whitest cities in the country.
I'd never think that walking through the city.
Yeah, and so there is tremendous progress to be made on that front. I mean, just looking around tech, like we don't hire enough women into tech. We don't promote them into positions of leadership as much as we need to and we should be. I look at it as there's a lot of work to be done. People like us have a responsibility to do what we can to further it and promote it. And that should be forcing a shift from norms of the past, right? It should, I'm a sort of an anti-authoritarian type of person by nature. So I don't really believe or ascribe to norms to begin with. And so, and if I had, I don't think I would ever have been anything other than, what would have traditionally been my path. I would have just, I would have been a doctor or some other profession that like had been laid out for me that was very typical for, people who kind of came from my background and my, sort of what my parents had done.
Doctor, a lawyer, what else?
Or an engineer,
there?
right? Yeah.
Right.
And they're all respectable professions. There's nothing wrong with that. But like, you should also have the freedom to explore and do what it is that you want, what you feel is right for yourself. And a lot of that is being able to break through whatever those norms are, right? So that's where I think that diversity matters, because you need to see people of all different backgrounds doing a variety of different things to understand that really anything is possible. Right? And that's one of the most encouraging things that I see now about what's going on with like media, right? Like with the music and with TV shows and movies, you're seeing more and more of this. And this is the thing that I'm excited about for my children, right? I'm Indian, my wife's Korean, our children are half Indian, half Korean. They're going to see a whole bunch of media and they're going to look at that and say like, oh, I see, yeah, my parents do this and this, but I also see all these other portrayals of people who are like me in one way, shape, or form doing a bunch of different things. And that matters. Like, it's really important. And I don't think we talk about that enough and or emphasize it enough for everybody. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the reasons I love that you're here talking about this, right? Because you have this unique perspective of two different races and kind of growing up in this amazing city. So do you see that impacting your kids in school?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. So, when I was growing up here, there were like 2 or 3 other Indian kids in my class, sometimes in my school, depending on, elementary school versus middle school versus high school. And I think that it's an unusual and slightly challenging position to be in, right? Where you're one of like very few of a certain group. It's very easy to have to shoulder quite a bit of responsibility for a whole group when you're that one kid. I remember like being in elementary school and like we're talking about India, and the elementary school teacher is like looking at me during the India lesson for confirmation about all the facts of India, and I'm like, I'm not a.
I was born here.
Yeah, there's like 1 billion people in the country, and I'm not from there, right? So, yes, it's my my heritage and my ethnicity, and I'm proud of it, and all of those things. But I'm not the expert. And I'm also there's no sole representative. So yeah. I mean, when I look at this and I think about it for my kids, I think it's we made a conscious decision to be in a location, in a place where they would be able to experience a tremendous amount of diversity. That was a very clear, distinct guiding factor in where we decided to buy a house, what schools we wanted to go to, or we wanted them to go to, rather. And, it's that's where the future is headed, right? The future is not headed toward isolated groups and pockets of people that don't associate with everyone else, right? One of my favorite comedians is Russell Peters, and he's got a funny line about, how many Indian people there are in the world and how many Chinese people there are in the world and all of these things. And he's like, basically the whole world's going beige, right? And
it's true, though.
Yeah, and I mean, he's obviously a comedian. He's taking it to a certain extreme, but, the future of the world is very multicultural and very diverse. And I think the sooner that, everyone embraces that, and the sooner that our kids get to experience that and not feel like they're the outlier, but that they're the norm, the easier and the better experience that they're going to have with that.
I mean, around here, they are the norm, right?
Yeah.
But do you have to, now that at least the 5-year-old, right, is old enough now, do you have to do any additional teaching or kind of like explain the world to your kids in any different way to kind of prepare them to be adults? Soon enough they're going to be adults, and there's going to be this ever-changing world.
Yeah. I mean, I think that just comes with the territory of being a parent, right? You have to look out and a few steps ahead and try to do what you can to guide them and lead them in that direction. I mean, I think, kids say the darndest things and they ask the darndest questions, right? And so there are some funny ones that we've encountered, but yeah, it's.
Are there any funny ones you can share on the podcast that?
I mean, we've gotten funny questions about, skin color has come up, right? As a 5-year-old asking about skin color, and that's an interesting one to talk about. And, light colors versus yellow colors versus brown colors. And, he's a 5-year-old, so he brings in blue and yellow and purple and all these other colors, right? Yeah. And so it's an opportunity. I look at all of these things as opportunities to have a discussion, right? And to be able to convey, like, skin color is it's what you see, but that's, you need everyone is a person, and you need to think about how you connect with people and how you treat people on the basis of them being people, right? And also, I think I'm a little bit sensitive to this, but I also encourage them. I'm like, you should not allow anyone to treat you worse on the basis of something like that. Like, you need to kind of stand up and stick up for yourself. And so, some of that is just on the basis of my experience, right? Being a relative minority growing up, around here. So.
Interesting. I just realized on the question of color, well, my 3-year-old hasn't asked it yet, but if she did, I know that I would start with explaining how pigments and skin work, and go that way first, because I know that would get us in a rabbit hole of like, oh, well, what are pigments? How does skin work? And that would turn into this like hour-long science lesson that the next morning she probably wouldn't remember, but it'd still be fun, because I don't know how to explain the social norms, or they're not really norms, but biases, right? Like at this age.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing, but kids are going to hear it and see it, and one thing I struggle with is I try to listen to NPR in the morning with my son on the way into school. It's hard to listen to the news in the morning with a 5-year-old. Like, there's just a lot of not great stuff on the news, and a lot of it is, unfortunately, in the current climate, a lot of it is sort of racial, right? Or it's ethnic based. And so it's a tough time right now to deal with, a kid at that age and the current climate and what's going on in the news, and and to your point, be able to try to explain it all, but not expect a whole lot of it to stick, right? That's a tough. It's
maybe there's a room for a radio show which is all news for kids,
news
so
for
you can
kids,
listen to it in the morning.
Kid friendly NPR. Yeah. I would sign up for that.
Well, I've got the podcasting gear already. Okay, no, that's great to hear. I mean, it sounds like I guess I haven't met your kids in person yet, but it sounds like they're gonna grow to be pretty fabulous individuals.
We're doing what we can. We hope so.
Just a couple more questions.
Sure.
You went to Stanford and Carnegie Mellon, right, for education. And so had a pretty good career with a couple jobs, a couple startups. I mean, right now you're doing very well for yourself. but education system is changing quite a bit. Is there anything you're doing to prepare your kids for that, or?
Yeah, I think that's so. Thank you. I mean, yeah, I've kind of turned into a cliche, I guess, right? The Stanford alum who now does startup stuff, but
the Indian guy.
Yeah, but I put my time in, right? I worked at small companies and big companies before I kind of went off the deep end with startups. But yeah, I mean, I do think a lot about education and our children. I was really fortunate. My parents, at a very young age, really stressed the importance of education, and I took it really seriously. And for me, in many ways, education was a ticket, right, mm-hmm. to be able to get to kind of independence and a life that I wanted to build initially for myself, and then with my wife, and then now with the family. And I'm fortunate. My wife is very similarly minded. She grew up with education being extremely important. She's internally a very driven person. So yeah, we both place high value on it. I think we share similar values about how we think about educating our kids. In spite of how much I love technology and how much I've dedicated myself to the field, our kids are relative Luddites. No time with the phone, mm-hmm. no time with no screen time, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, or very little screen time. Mm-hmm. They watch a couple hours of TV on the weekend, right? And it's interesting because when I talk to peers of mine in a similar situation, we spend a lot of time in technology, who have young children, they have taken a very similar tact, right? And I think we all kind of share the belief that there's time for them to learn that stuff and pick up on it. And by the way, it's no judgment, right? We've got friends who do the tablet thing and who do the phone thing, or they've got other types of toys that are more technology oriented for their kids, and that's great, right? Everyone's kind of got to do what they think is best for their kids, and so no judgment on that. But for us, we just have tried and to large part succeeded in avoiding that for the time being. Mm-hmm. And I think about that in the context of education for our kids, because I'm like, I want them to really focus on the fundamentals, mm-hmm. right? Like, one of the things that strikes me now, particularly in the time that we're in, where it's sort of the era of distraction, mm-hmm. with like Twitter and Facebook
Absolutely.
And notifications and all of these things, is how important it is to cultivate focus.
Oh, your Apple Watch is buzzing.
Yeah. So focus is super critical as just a core skill. And, I think that being able to work on those types of skills with our kids at this age is more important than trying to get them to figure out how to navigate a tablet or browse the web or something like that. I think that those are things that if they figure out some of the more foundational skills and have the time to develop and focus on those things, they'll be able to hopefully pick up those other things later.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, and that's how we try to explain this to, say, our grandparents, who inevitably end up putting a phone in front of a kid, here and there, and it's really hard to compete with a phone because it's such an easy tool. It's like, what if she's just browsing through photos? Well, it's really easy to browse through photos. It's really hard to sit down and read a book, mm-hmm. or pretend read a book. A 3-year-old doesn't read yet, right? But the pretend reading is way better than scrolling through photos. But once you start competing with technology, it's impossible. So I forgot. Did you guys send your kids to Montessori school or?
Yes. Our son is in Montessori right now. Yeah, our daughters will be going to one soon.
Yeah. That sounds like a great idea, because at least kids get to sit down and just do their thing for as long as they want to, and
there's some structure to it. I mean, but the general principle of learn by play mm-hmm. is I mean, I think it's very compatible with a lot of different types of kids. Right? It's not for everybody, right? And I understand that, but when I was younger, I did a combination of Montessori and some like experimental something or the other between like UW and some school around here, and it worked. It was also sort of driven by this learning through play.
Wait, you weren't in UCDS by any chance, were you?
UCDS?
That's the UW school for kids.
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah. I'll check with my mom and let you know.
Yeah,
I don't remember what it was called. I was too young. But yeah, I mean, I think, we tend to get really, as a culture, we tend to get really caught up in like technology is going to solve all of our problems, and we leave some of these fundamentals behind. Mm-hmm. And, learning how to learn is kind of the first thing. And we try to not lose track of that.
We're getting close to the end, but there's one question that's very relevant and has been on my mind a lot. There are a lot of companies and even, the old school educational institutions, everyone's now promoting learning to code for kids. Mm-hmm. But given everything we talked about, and you being the founder of a startup and you needing to hire people who know how to code, do you think it's important that kids learn to code? And if yes or no, right? Like at what point and what should they focus on? And maybe not even just kids, but, young adults throughout like teens and 20s, because I see these questions come up on startup boards where people say, oh, well, my job is an X, but should I go learn to code? And if I should, then what language? Mm-hmm. It's really popular, but I'm just curious, what's your take on it, given that you actually need people who know how to code?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, a lot of my thinking on this has evolved, right? So it's funny because I think it's really fashionable for people these days to be like, well, I've always believed this and this is right and now it's true and I told you so, right? Mm-hmm. But I think I was wrong earlier, right? So, I have a background in computer science, mm-hmm. right? I did a formal degree. I started programming before I went to college. I spent a summer actually at Carnegie Mellon in high school and took an intro CS class there. But I was not programming from a very young age, but I started a little bit before college, yep. Right? I tried it out.
Same here.
And, when these certificate programs and academies and, all boot camps and all these things were coming online years ago, when they first were showing up, right? I was naive, and I thought, man, what are people going to learn in 10 weeks? Uh-huh. How can they learn enough in 10 weeks to be able to contribute and be as good as someone who's gone through like a formal degree program uh-huh. and all of these things, right? But now I think, I have changed my thinking for a variety of different reasons. So one, to answer your initial question, I absolutely 100% believe kids should be exposed to software development mm-hmm. or should be exposed to computer science, right? Probably more computer science than just like the general coding thing. Mm-hmm. Because I think that there's something interesting about getting people to understand, computer science is basically, it's like applied math, mm-hmm. right? And you teach math anyway. And mm-hmm. so I think getting people to think algorithmically is interesting, mm-hmm. right? And getting kids to relate how all of the things that they use in the world around them and more of the things that they use mm-hmm. in the world around them have software underlying that, mm-hmm. right? So being able to relate those two things together is important. I don't mm-hmm. think we do enough to expose kids to it. I mean, when I was in high school, I did like an AP computer science class as self-study, right? There was no formal class. Mm-hmm. I had to go and petition a physics teacher and say, hey, can I do this? And then, did it on my own, right? Uh-huh. And now I know, especially around here, there's like AP classes, all around for every single mm-hmm. subject. But I do think we should, just like we expose kids to reading, writing, math, mm-hmm. foreign languages, music, we should include, computer science and maybe some coding as part of that. That's not to say that I think everybody should be a software engineer. Mm-hmm. Everybody doesn't need to be super proficient with coding. Right. But they should have that exposure. And I think that would go a long way towards, us having a more welcoming culture in tech to people from more, diverse backgrounds, which we don't currently have right now. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then on sort of later stage stuff, I've got a close friend who is switching careers. He was in business and law, uh-huh. and he's really interested in being a software engineer, and he's teaching it to himself. He's incredibly intelligent. He was in a close group of friends that we had. He's a super sharp guy who will make a phenomenal software engineer because he's one of the smartest people that I know. But he doesn't have the resume, right? He doesn't have like the the degree and, he's doing a self-taught, he will eventually be an amazing software engineer. Someone's got to take a chance on him to make that happen. And so that's where like a lot of my thinking has shifted, and I've recognized, my earlier thoughts were fairly naive. And so we've never had a requirement in either of our companies that people have to have a degree. One of the best software engineers that I worked with at T-Mobile basically came straight out of high school, self-taught, right? So we're open to people of all different types of backgrounds, all different types of experiences. And I think that as an industry, we have to keep an open mind on how people arrive at the profession and judge people on, their talent, their fit, their background, how they came to get to be where they are, give people credit for the struggles that they've been through, give people a chance. And that's how we end up with a more inclusive culture. That's what we need. We want to have better products that serve everybody and not just work well for certain groups of people.
Yeah.
We need to have a more inclusive culture.
And it makes sense that you include people who end up being the users of the product.
Exactly.
No, I love it. It's a very weighted answer, right? And it's just like, it's not like you have to lean all in or not do it at all, but there's time and there's degree to which you should expose your kids.
Yeah, I mean, I love what Code.org is doing, right? They've created the table stakes curriculum for teachers to be able to bring it in, right? I've tried like a little bit of their stuff to see what it's like. I'll probably eventually give it to my kids, but I think it's on the right track.
Well, so your kids 5 and 3, give or take, and you're in a high-stress work environment, or at least maybe if not stress, then demand, right? What would you... There are a lot of lessons in what we talked about for people to dissect on their own and see how it fits their personal life. But if you were to sort of give advice to parents in your situation or parents who will inevitably end up, do you think... what can they do to prepare themselves so to manage it better?
So I'm lucky. I've got an amazing wife who is very supportive, but also is very honest and direct with me, right? So she lets me know how I'm doing. I think that's important because you need another perspective. And, it's easy to get caught up in work. For me in particular,
right.
Like it's very easy for me to get caught up and lost in work. And so being able to kind of get shaken out of that from time to time is pretty important.
So talk to each other.
Yeah, communication is pretty important. I think the big thing is, a lot of people don't really know what they want. They don't, not a lot of people spend the time to be introspective and figure out what it is you want and then structure your life around it, right? And so sometimes we want things that we can't have immediately. It takes time to build up to it. It takes time to get it. Maybe you've got to accumulate, time. You've got to accumulate money. You've got to accumulate all these things. But what are the priorities? What is it that you want in your life? And then really be able to try to plan and structure things around it. And I've, for better or worse, have figured out, there's something that's really important for me to build. And that's why we started this company. It's the most efficient way to do it, even though it's pretty hard and it's a lot of work. I'm a glutton for punishment, right? Which is why decided to start another company again. But it's also it's really important for me to spend time with my kids. It's really important for me to teach them what I can, for them to always feel like I'm going to be there for them when they need me. And so that's people talk about work-life balance and all these things. My take on it is, I don't like the description of a balance because it feels like you've got to give up on one thing to get the other. And I instead look at it as, on any given day, one thing is going to take priority. And so how do you structure what you're doing to achieve, that priority in the best way that you possibly can? And so for me, some days it's like on the weekends, sometimes it's going to be things with my kids. On the weekends, sometimes it's going to be things with work too, right? And so those are the trade-offs. I also think that if you want to go into an early stage startup, you want to be a founder, there is a certain amount of sacrifice that comes with it. There's a really good friend of mine who's in San Francisco. He started a company, slaved away for about a decade. He had a He had like a passable outcome. You know, he didn't make a ton of money, didn't lose a lot of money for his investors. It was sort of middle of the road that way. But he's got 3 kids, and he and I are like very simpatico on the struggle. When we talk about it, you know, he gets it, and we get each other on a basic level. And when we were talking about this, you know, every time we get together, we talk about this, and you have to acknowledge that there is a degree of sacrifice that comes with it. And it may not be, you know, it may not be the kids, it may not be your work, but it might be your health, or it might be your sleep, or it might be other parts of your family or travel or whatever. So I think if you go into the expectation that you can somehow have it all, you set yourself up for failure and frustration.
Makes sense. I mean, they say you got to focus when you do a company, right? But that focus extends beyond just the company. Your entire life has to be focused around what's important, and something's going to have to go out of the window.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing that I think is, especially if you're expecting a kid and you're worried about this, one significant difference for me pre-kid and post-kid that I figured out is I'm way more efficient as a father. Way, way, way more efficient as a father. Like in terms of what I get done, how I get it done, cutting out things that were sort of like not particularly productive or a good use of time. And then also having a clear sense of myself and knowing, okay, I really need to take a break from work, or I really need some personal time to myself, or, you know, those sorts of things. So the efficiency factor goes up considerably when you have really explicit demands. Like I can't face like the disappointment of letting my kids down. And so that's, you know, that is that's a motivating factor for me to figure out how to be way more efficient.
That's good. Yeah. It makes total sense for me, but hopefully this will give our listeners some idea to ponder on, you know, and figure out how to structure life properly.
Yeah.
Well, it's been really good. I loved everything you had to say, and there's really a lot to think about and to kind of help people fully understand how to do their life or what to expect if they're in a similar situation. So thank you very much for coming. If there's anything else you want to say to, you know, dads, feel free.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. I think it's great that you're doing this. It's a team effort, you know, raising kids. I think it's good to get more fathers out there thoughtful about what it's like to be a parent, think about their life and their job and what it's like to be in tech. And yeah, it's cool that you're doing this. So happy to be here.